Today we're speaking with Joel Beinin, professor of Middle East history at Stanford University, on the Great March of Return in Gaza, implications for the struggle for Palestinian rights, and the links to the broader politics of the Middle East. Joel, let's begin with the events in Gaza of last spring. We're talking today, September 3rd, 2018, 5 months after the world's attention was once more drawn to the Gaza Strip. Explain what took place there, the background and circumstances that led to the protests, and the brutal Israeli response.
A young journalist from Gaza, Ahmed Abu Ratima, had been advocating for some years for a mass march of refugees from the Gaza Strip across the barrier that Israel has built in the direction of their homes. So there's about 1.9 million inhabitants of the Gaza Strip, and nearly 70% of them are refugees. He renewed that call a month after Donald Trump announced that the United States would be moving its embassy to Jerusalem in December of 2016. So on January 5th, I think it was, he put a post up on his Facebook page calling again for such a march. And it received a lot of endorsement and discussion, and he subsequently became one of the organizers and spokespeople for what he called the Great March of Return, and that name was adopted by all of those who participated and organized. So the campaign began on March 30th, which is Land Day. That commemorates a demonstration in which 6 Palestinian citizens of Israel were shot dead in a demonstration protesting Israeli seizure of their lands. So it was an important symbolic occasion. And on March 30th and every Friday since then, including this past Friday, people have gathered at various points inside the Gaza Strip, protesting and raising 2 demands. One, that Israel lift the siege, which it has maintained on the Gaza Strip with the collaboration of Egypt since 2007. And second, the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes.
Now, in parallel to the events in Gaza was the unfolding of a new U.S. policy initiative in Jerusalem. What do you see as the key elements of the new U.S. administration's Middle East policy, both specifically focused on Israel-Palestine and for the broader Middle East?
So for Israel-Palestine, the Trump administration has essentially adopted the program advocated by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. That is, that there will not be a sovereign Palestinian state. State minus is how Netanyahu refers to his vision for the West Bank. So moving the American embassy to Jerusalem, saying nothing at all about the further expansion of settlements. That's now official U.S., well, if it's not official policy, it's in practice, U.S. policy. This is being done for 2 reasons. First, the advisors and funders around Trump, so Sheldon Adelson, who is the funder-in-chief of the Trump administration, son-in-law Jared Kushner, Middle East advisor Jason Greenblatt, ambassador to Israel David Friedman, they are all completely supportive of the settlement project. Ambassador Friedman has generously funded a yeshiva in one of the more militant settlements in the West Bank. So on the one hand, those are the people who are making U.S. policy. On the other hand, Trump has apparently established a special relationship with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, who is called MBS. The first foreign trip of President Trump after he was inaugurated was to Saudi Arabia. There was the bizarre scene with him and the king with their hands on the orb and so on. No one really explained what that was all about, but what happened as a result of that visit was an increase in American arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and B, apparently approval for the Saudi and Emirati-led campaign to isolate Iran in the Middle East, and that has involved turning a blind eye to massive slaughter of civilians in Yemen. The Saudis and Emiratis have been conducting a campaign against the Houthis in Yemen, claiming that they are tools of Iran, which was not at all the case when it began, but since they have been attacked, the Houthis have indeed been seeking and getting some aid from Iran. It has involved declaring a boycott on Qatar on the grounds that Qatar supports terrorists. This is not the case at all. Qatar does have good relations with the Muslim Brothers. It does have good relations with Tunisia's Ennahda party. It has been providing a humanitarian assistance to the Gaza Strip under Hamas's rule. These are basically non-Wahhabi, which is the Saudi form of Islamism, non-Wahhabi Islamist political currents. And Qatar can do that because it's enormously rich, since it has the largest natural gas condensate field in the world, which it happens to share with Iran, and therefore can't afford to have strained relations with Iran.
Do you see the U.S. administration's policy towards Iran as simply the resurgence of a set of interests, including hardline elements within Israel, interests that had lost out under the Obama administration? Or is this something new emerging from the U.S. administration?
Well, this line has been around before. So John Bolton was in the administration of George W. Bush. And after the launch of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, he was one of those talking about, well, Iraq was easy. The real challenge is Syria and Iran. So he was talking about attacking Iran even then, and now that he is back in office and part of the Trump administration, he's been a big proponent of that line of thinking. But really, it's the Emiratis who are the political brain, and the Saudis, who have the most money, who are promoting this idea, with Egypt going along, since the Saudis and the Emiratis have bailed out the Egyptian government to the tune of some maybe $28 billion by now since 2013. And Israel is very happy with this orientation, and consequently, the Emiratis in particular have been growing closer to Israel, although the Saudis also have a relationship with Israel. Egypt, of course, has long had a peace treaty with Israel, but it's mostly been a very cold peace.
Can you explain with some greater detail, perhaps, the background here, the historic background, with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and their evolving internal politics and their evolving relations with Israel and the United States?
So the bottom line is, there are three possible countries who can be the regional power in the Gulf. Iraq, but Iraq is on the ropes because it doesn't have a stable government and is still very weak after the American invasion of 2003. Saudi Arabia, because of its oil wealth and its alliance with the United States, and Iran. So fundamentally, neither the Saudis nor the United States want Iran to be a viable contender for that regional influential position. And that's been consistent American policy since the Iranian Revolution of 1979 that ousted the Shah and installed Ayatollah Khomeini and eventually the creation of the Islamic Republic. So this doesn't actually have anything to do with Islam per se, and it certainly doesn't have anything to do with some sort of purported historic Sunni-Shia antagonism, although in certain instances there have been antagonisms along sectarian lines. It's about who's going to be the regional top dog. And at this point, both the United States and Israel prefer that it be the Saudis and their sidekick, the Emiratis. It's really the Sheikh of Dubai, Mohammed bin Zayed, who is the political heavyweight in the United Arab Emirates, but also the mentor, if you will, of Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who's the visionary, if you will, behind this realignment of the region on an anti-Iranian axis.
And you talked about this briefly, but could you go over a bit more how Qatar fits into this picture?
So Qatar muddies the waters for several reasons. One, there is now talk of a plan where Egypt and Qatar will mediate some kind of long-term truce between Hamas and the Netanyahu government. And commentators have been saying that this is actually quite a viable idea because neither the Israeli government nor Hamas believes in resolving the conflict. But they are okay with a long-term truce, thinking that they'll come out better or be stronger at the end of it. So Qatar would invest some as high as $1 billion has been booted about to rebuild the Gaza Strip, upgrade a port, and perhaps also establish an industrial zone on the Egyptian side of the border near Rafah. Rafah city is split half between the Gaza Strip and half between Egyptian Sinai. And Palestinians from the Gaza Strip would be able to work there. Also Bedouin from Egypt, because one of the motors of the insurgency in Sinai is that the Egyptian government, all Egyptian governments since forever, have not invested anything in the economic development of the North Sinai, so that unemployment is very high there, and that's a natural recruiting ground for the Islamic State. So Qatar can do this because Qatar has a history of having good relations with Hamas. Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brothers. So this creates a problem for Egypt because the Egyptian regime has said that the Muslim Brothers are terrorists and they've hunted them down and massacred them on the way to coming to power, the current military regime. So this will somehow have to be mediated, that Qatar will have to be made acceptable to the Saudis, to the Emiratis, to the Egyptians for this to happen. It's too soon to make a guess about the chances of that happening.
Is it your feeling that these political alliances and tensions are somewhat fluid and uncertain, or do you see a more substantial and stable plan and strategy emerging in the Middle East, with the U.S. playing a leading and decisive role? Or are Israel and the Saudis playing the greater leadership role in the direction of these policies?
Right now, it's Israel, the Saudis, and the Emiratis who are playing the lead role. And that's in part because the Trump administration simply doesn't seem to have the capacity to formulate a foreign policy strategy with any coherence. Whatever Trump thinks when he gets up in the morning and starts tweeting is what the policy is. On the other hand, Benjamin Netanyahu has been absolutely clear, certainly since he came back into office for the second time in 2009, that Iran is the problem, radical Islam is the problem, the Palestinians are just a distraction, and therefore the world's energies should be focused on Iran and not on getting Israel to make any kind of accommodations with the Palestinians. So that way of thinking about things came to mesh with the Saudi and Emirati way of thinking about things, because the Saudis in particular didn't like the way that Qatar was throwing its weight around. Qatar, because it is so wealthy from natural gas, has been punching way above its weight regionally. The Qatari government owns the Al Jazeera satellite TV channel. It had been intervening in the Syrian civil war. It had been supporting the presidency of Mohamed Morsi when he became the first freely elected president in Egypt and ruled for just about a year. So Qatar had been making many regional diplomatic initiatives, and the Saudis didn't like the fact that they were not totally in line with Saudi policy. So that's the origin of this boycott of Qatar since June of 2017. The United States was caught by surprise, and President Trump initially endorsed it, because this happened only a month after his visit to Saudi Arabia, and it almost seemed like it had been cleared with Trump. But then some of his advisors reminded Trump that Qatar is the host of the United States Fifth Fleet, so it's probably not such a good idea to say that the regime are a gang of terrorists. So the United States clearly was caught out in this, is uncomfortable with Qatar and the Saudis and Emiratis being at loggerheads, but the Trump administration seems to be too incompetent diplomatically to engineer a reconciliation which would be in everyone's interest.
What are the general outlines of the so-called peace plan or resolution to the Palestine-Israel conflict that are currently being pursued by the U.S. administration?
We don't know. Rumors have been leaked. I would say that when and if it is revealed, because it is uncertain if it will ever actually be revealed, it will be dead on arrival. For example, one of the ideas that was floated is that Jason Greenblatt met with the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas and asked him, would he be amenable to a Palestinian-Jordanian federation? And Abbas very cleverly said, sure, if Israel was part of it too. Well, okay, Israel is not accepting that, so that's not going to happen. But this is an expression of the revival of long outmoded thinking. Because before the Oslo process, the Israeli Labor Party thought that that was the solution to the conflict. Israel would evacuate part of the West Bank, keep whatever it wanted and thought was strategically important, and then there would be a Palestinian-Jordanian Federation and there wouldn't be a Palestinian state, and that would solve the problem. But obviously, it didn't solve the problem. The other piece of the solution is this plan to rehabilitate Gaza and to create some kind of industrial free zone in the northeast of the Sinai Peninsula. That's an expression of an economic piece as opposed to a political piece, which is the outlook of the current Israeli government and has been embraced in the past by many Israeli governments, Labor-led and Likud-led alike. So the obstacle to that is whether or not Qatar can be integrated to the plan, and also the fact that the Emiratis and Saudis have their own candidate for who should be in charge of the Gaza Strip if it is rehabilitated, and that's Mohammed Dahlan. Especially, he's quite close to the Emirati government. But if Qatar is involved heavily in the plan, then that will perhaps not be acceptable to Qatar. So there are elements of a plan which would, even if the Palestinians would be allowed to call something a state, would really fall far short of sovereignty and self-determination. I don't think it's very likely that any of this will come to pass.
You've described the Great March of Return as perhaps a concrete example of new modes of resistance being taken up by young Palestinians. Can you explain that further, and perhaps what you see as the prospects for such resistance in the months and years ahead?
So Ahmed Abu Ratima, who I mentioned earlier as one of the initiators and spokespersons for the Great March of Return, has explicitly embraced nonviolence. And he has argued that nonviolent mass action is the only option that the Palestinians have left. This is plausible, especially to young people, because neither Hamas nor Fatah, which is the principal party supporting the Palestinian Authority, have much credibility anymore among young Palestinians. And this could very well be part of the reason that Israel responded to the Great March of Return with such massive violence. To date, over 160 demonstrators have been killed. More than 15,000 have been wounded. And there was at no point any serious threat to Israel or to the Israeli army. The Israeli army firing on unarmed civilian demonstrators, including medics and journalists and children, of course, inflamed many of the demonstrators, and that's when things like kites with Molotov cocktails and balloons with incendiary devices started to be directed across the border into Israel. So it's unclear what the future of this kind of politics is, because both Hamas and Fatah oppose it. Not in the case of Fatah because they want to launch an armed struggle, they don't, but they don't want to lose political control over the Palestinian Authority and over the Palestinian people more broadly. Hamas still imagines that it might engage in an armed struggle, although there have been many voices in Hamas for over a decade that have suggested that there's a possibility of reaching a 99-year truce with Israel. So there too, Hamas would significantly lose influence in the Gaza Strip if this kind of political activity got any traction. In fact, Hamas was not an organizer of the Great March of Return, but once it became clear that it was popular, they jumped in and they used their resources to promote it and to put themselves in a prominent position, if not leading it, certainly appearing to lead it or allowing the Israelis to claim that they were leading it. So I think there is a great hunger for this new political direction, which would necessarily be nonviolent, because that's the only way that large numbers of Palestinians can participate. But there are obstacles on all sides, both internally on the Palestinian front, opposition from the PA and opposition from Hamas, and Israel is opposed to it because this is the most difficult thing for them to manage. If somebody throws a bomb or fires a rocket, they know what to do about that, and the world has stood by and let them do it massively. But the Great March of Return and the Israeli response to that provoked considerable criticism in the world, including from the Secretary General of the United Nations. Of course, not from the Trump administration. But Israel paid a great deal for its decision to use massive firepower to suppress an unarmed demonstration.
Here in the United States, what are the ways that you see for Palestinian solidarity activists and organizations to productively engage in support for this struggle?
The bottom line is that Israel has been allowed to do what it has done for the last 50 years in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip because the United States government has either actively supported it or passively accepted it. So the focus has to be on changing U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And that can happen in the same way that progressive social movements have brought about other changes in U.S. government policy. It means a broad campaign to educate people. A huge portion of the American people still has no idea what this conflict is about and what the stakes are and why we should care at all. And secondly, once people have begun to be educated, they need to be organized into communities and organizations that can exert political pressure. That can be done in the electoral arena. We've seen recently Democratic candidates winning primary contests who have not backed off from supporting Palestinian rights. Some of them are certainly going to be elected because there is no Republican challenger in November. That isn't going to directly translate into a change in American policy, but it means that there will be people in Congress who we can speak to and who at least have a minimal understanding of the issue and sympathy with Palestinian rights. But I don't believe that congressional action, even if it will ultimately be necessary, is the thing to focus on now. I think we can much more productively focus on organizing churches, community organizations, even some synagogues. There are now, I think, 15 synagogues in the United States that are formally non-Zionist or anti-Zionist synagogues. So this is a big change too. The problem is that this kind of education and organization work is a long-term project, and it may take longer than the time that the Palestinians have.
You've been working with Jewish Voice for Peace since its early days in the Bay Area. Why have you chosen to work with Jewish Voice for Peace, and what do you see as the most promising avenues of work for that organization, both nationally, but also specifically in the two chapters you've worked in San Francisco and here in Portland, Oregon?
I began to work with Jewish Voice for Peace around the outbreak of the Second Intifada in the fall of 2001, because at that point, at least in the Bay Area, there was no longer a possibility of joint Jewish-Palestinian or Jewish-Arab work. Everything I had done before then, both in the Bay Area and in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I gotten my PhD, was in the framework of organizations that had Palestinians, Israelis, Arab Americans, Jewish Americans, and others as well. But that, because of the particular political configuration at the time in the Bay Area, after 2001, that no longer became possible, and Jewish Voice for Peace was the most successful organization, grew very quickly after the outbreak of the Second Intifada, and became a national organization and is now probably the single largest organization supporting Palestinian rights in the country. So, especially for Jews, but even there are many non-Jews who are members of Jewish Voice for Peace. This is the place to be.
Joel Beinin, thanks for joining us today, and we'll look forward to our next conversation on the Middle East.
Thank you.